Hi there, I'm James R.J. Hoyman. In my new book, Overlap Values, I explain that in the 21st century, we face large shared problems like climate change, rising income inequality, and even jihadism. But we can address these problems if we can find a new power to cooperate, both for political and cultural change. Luckily, science-informed philosophy is ready to point us toward shareable values that would radically improve our capacity to cooperate. I call these overlap values since they would be a set of values where various different people's religious and non-religious worldviews would overlap. But I'm not speaking of an overlap that results merely from happenstance or luck, but I'm talking about a more stable kind of overlap. I'm speaking of values that overlap because they're based on reasons that appeal to people across worldview lines. To identify those kind of overlap values, I argue that what we need are some shareable aspects of practical philosophy. That is, philosophy that provides guidance for everyday life, which is a somewhat underdeveloped branch of philosophy. In my book, I provide an overview of the Overlap Values project. That's the purpose of the book, Overlap Values. The goal of the project itself is to create key elements of just such a practical philosophy by applying to everyday life philosophy's best theories about the natures of knowledge, goodness, and the good society. But this is about cooperation globally, since problems like climate change are global problems. Around the globe, the vast majority of us human beings are religious. As such, my book had to show that believers could support these values for religious reasons. Focusing on Christianity and Islam, the world's two largest religions, my book provides a tool for religious interpretation. Using basic religious language, which is familiar to me from my Christian background, my book argues that science and philosophy are exactly the kinds of tools that believers now need to pursue religious ideals in this shared world and during this lifetime. Next, I provide a window into how I will justify certain specific values concerning knowledge, goodness, and the good society. This is where the real meat of the book comes into play and the surprising stuff happens, the really surprising stuff. Well, the most surprising stuff. I introduce new answers concerning the meaning of the words knowledge and truth. Now, these answers flow out of the other book that I'm publishing at the same time, Knowledge by Acceptance. Knowledge by Acceptance is essentially a work of academic philosophy, advancing the field of epistemology is what it's called, the theory of knowledge. And I've written that in a language as accessible as possible, and thus I say that it's an intellectual book. It's for an intellectual audience, not just an academic audience. So my goal was to make it accessible to a general intellectual audience. This book that I'm speaking about, Overlap Values, is a popular audience book, and thus I include it in what I call the popular stream of my project, the Overlap Values project. Knowledge by Acceptance, I say, is in my intellectual stream of the project. So there you go. From that book, Knowledge by Acceptance, what I do is extract the conclusion of, I think it's a 280-page argument, what it works out to. Although not all of those pages, of course, is directly leading up to that one conclusion, but the conclusion of the argument that takes up most of the book is trying to explain how do we differentiate knowledge from non-knowledge, what philosophers call an analysis of knowledge. When we analyze knowledge into a list of conditions that, when met, indicate that a person knows something rather than merely believing it. I give you my answer to that question, which is a question that has been vexing philosophers for over 2,300 years, since the time of Plato. It seems that I've solved that problem, and I present my solution in even more accessible language right within Overlap Values in the chapter on knowledge and truth. I also provide my new answer to the question of what is truth, what philosophers call a theory of truth, that I base upon a very strong answer from another philosopher, Alvin Goldman, where I simply did some tweaking. There was something not quite right with his definition, as I seemed to me, as I argued, so I did a minor tweak there and came up with a new theory of truth there. So those are exciting to me, to be able to give very clear answers to the questions, what is truth, and how do I know when I know? How do I know when someone else knows? Those are right-in overlap values for you. I then include strong suggestions about how I plan to explain the nature of absolute morality. Of course, one of the other major problems that have been on the minds of philosophers since the time of Plato. I base my suggested area of answers, where I think the right answers lie, on some relatively recent moral philosophy, that actually philosophy about the foundations of morality. And I show how this will justify values of universal respect and dignity. I also include things we can say about what it means to speak of a good society. I should mention that on the stuff that I'm talking about, how do we explain the nature of absolute morality, that incorporates the mathematical framework known as game theory. It's from a wonderful philosopher who wrote a prominent book in the 1980s, David Gautier, and his book Morals by Agreement. So altogether, I point to values such as reasonableness, rationality, and support for political freedom and equality, all of which I plan to gather under a general heading of nobility. So this would be a character trait that, in general, a collection of the different positive character traits that it's good for an individual human being to try to build. The book suggests a new social identity term that could be shared across dividing lines to facilitate political and cultural collaboration. The term I suggest is overlap humanism. I explain why my sense of this term can appeal to both the religious and the non-religious, and I also explain why this term can appeal to those who advocate for the ethical treatment of animals. I conclude Overlap Values, that book, by discussing a way forward. I advocate collaboration in the political and cultural spheres to address these shared problems I had referred to, as well as any others that cause us problems. I also advocate sustaining the overlap values through childhood education, teaching our children not only math, science, and history, but also the kind of science-informed philosophy that will empower them to succeed in the global knowledge economy while being agents of political and social progress. So that's my summary of the book Overlap Values. I hope that you will, if you find that interesting, look into it further and see what you think.